Vaughn among the most brilliant that I've ever met. And his breadth of the law is quite captivating. In fact, I've become quite a student of his. Vaughn, if I'm not mistaken, was educated on the south side of Chicago originally.
That's correct.
From there, he went to Colgate.
Correct.
4 years at Colgate.
Correct.
And from Colgate, you were in that class, talk about that class at Harvard Law School.
I was in the class of 1971 at Harvard Law School. It was the first critical mass of black law students at Harvard. The faculty still refer to that group as the Wild Bunch, forged in the protests of the 60s, the civil rights movement, and so forth. That group has gone on to earn some incredible achievements. 5 Emmy Awards, a George M. Peabody Award, a Pulitzer Prize, a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, several federal judges, Reginald F. Lewis, the Wall Street tycoon, Randall Robinson, the noted author and international rights activist, and so on. It was an amazing group of people.
Was Charles Ogletree in that class?
Charles Ogletree came later. He was 7 or 8 years later. But
really?
No, he was not in that vanguard.
So you all kind of set the pace.
Well, we tried to set the standard, and the most amazing thing was that for nearly all of us, we were the first in our families to attend college. You know, I think that made the achievements all the more remarkable.
Recently, a word appeared in America. Today is this month is Black History Month, and Vaughn and I have some feelings about Black History Month. Some good, some not so good. I feel the Afro-American movement in this country since Jamestown has been as much a part of the history of America as Paine, as Washington, as the founders, because we were the bodies that this country was built on. If you go to Jamestown, Virginia today, you will see that there. I am very interested. Afro-American lawyers have had a rich tradition in this country and in our movement, especially since the so-called Emancipation Proclamation, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Some of the first ones that you were struck by.
Well, Charles Hamilton Houston, of course, who was the architect of the civil rights movement in the early part of the 20th century. Very brilliant man, educated in the public schools of Washington, D.C., Amherst College, and an editor of the Law Review at Harvard Law School, the first black member of the Law Review. And let me just make it clear, much has been said about Barack Obama being the president of the Harvard Law Review, and you know, people have said, oh, well, you know, that means he was the first editor. No, he was not the first editor. He was the first president. The first actual editor of the Law Review was Charles Hamilton Houston back in 1916. His cousin, who later became federal judge William H. Hastie, was an editor of the Law Review 10 years later in 1926. So,
Bill Hastie from Philadelphia.
Bill Hastie from Philadelphia, correct.
I grew up knowing his name.
Yep. So, you know, the line stretches back far, far beyond and past Barack Obama, which is not to say that, you know, he's not the greatest, but he's just the latest, as Muhammad Ali used to say. But I think that, you know, with a great degree of self-sacrifice, a number of black attorneys forged the design of the civil rights movement, and they implemented it. There were setbacks, there were disappointments along the way. There was great first personal and financial sacrifice, but they were unwavering. I think that all too many of them have not gotten the credit that they've deserved for bringing their people as far as we have come in the last 100 years. I would love to see an emphasis during Black History Month on the history of black lawyers in the United States and their contributions to the country.
There's an organization in Washington, D.C. that I'm well aware of, because I don't think it was up until the late 70s that Afro-American lawyers could join the American Bar.
That's correct.
The National Bar.
Right. There's a National Bar Association.
There's also a National Medical Association,
right,
too.
Exactly. Both of those professional organizations were established as a result of the segregation of the American Medical Association and the American Bar Association, both of which were not open to all members, to members of all races, until the early mid-60s. So it hasn't been that long. I don't think that black lawyers or doctors have forgotten just how recent that was, because the National Medical Association, the National Bar Association, the black organizations remain very strong and very dedicated in their membership.
We have a mutual friend
Who's that?
whose father was the president of the National Bar Association, who's associated with Middlebury.
Yeah, correct. Yes, I know.
Um,
Leroy Nesbitt Jr., correct.
Leroy Nesbitt Jr. Leroy Nesbitt Sr. was, as my understanding, Leroy's father was the first Afro-American lawyer to move downtown in Washington.
Yes and no. He was
Among the first.
He was among the first, but he was a protege of a very famous black lawyer by the name of Belford Lawson.
Talk about Belford Lawson a little bit.
Belford Lawson was an amazing man for what he accomplished in his time. He was born on a farm and came up in poverty in Roanoke, Virginia. He distinguished himself as a student and as an athlete, was the first black varsity football player for the University of Michigan. Played halfback in the 1920s, went to Yale Law School after that, and then became one of the members of the vanguard of the civil rights movement. His son, Belford V. Lawson III, happens to be one of my very best buddies, and we've been close friends for over 30 years. There's another story that has not been fully explored and told. There are endless lists. The list is endless of the names of the contributors, and we could go on. Suffice it to say that black lawyers have really made a contribution for the entire society, for everybody, because in so many ways they were able to breathe life into the Constitution and make it a living document, which I think was the intention of the framers.
You know, one of the things, how I became so aware, growing up in Philadelphia, I lived around a corner from Leon Higginbottom.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad and he were fast friends.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I knew about Bill Hasty, who was also among his accomplishments. Bill Hasty was the first black governor
of the Virgin Islands. And both Hasty and Higginbotham were federal judges.
Right.
Both were members of the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in Philadelphia. And A. Leon Higginbotham had a history not unlike that of so many of those of his time. He was given a brilliant student, was given a scholarship to Purdue University, where he showed up for enrollment in the 1940s and was told at the time that the dormitories did not accommodate black students and that they would have to live on the black side of town in a boarding house. He was referred to an attic with no heat, which is where any number of the black students at Purdue were forced to live. Leon Higginbotham, being the strong personality that he was, actually went to the dean of students of Purdue University and met with him face to face to complain of the circumstances, at which point the dean said to him, well, look, we're doing you a favor to have you here, and if you don't like it, you can leave, which is exactly what Leon Higginbotham did, transferring to Antioch College in Ohio at the end of his first year. He went on from there to Yale Law School, where he graduated first in his class in 1949, and at the same time, there was another black lawyer, William T. Coleman, who was first
Bill
in his
Coleman.
class at Harvard Law School.
Yeah,
So
Bill
in the same
Coleman.
year, you had two students who were valedictorians at Harvard Law School and Yale Law School, respectively. Both were black, and both were very renowned in their later careers.
There's another lawyer that comes to mind that tells a similar story about Princeton.
Bruce Wright.
Yes.
Yeah, he's a judge in New York. Bruce Wright applied to Princeton University in 1938. He was accepted. He showed up, at which point he was informed by the Princeton authorities that they did not know when he applied and was accepted that he was black, and that Princeton did not accept black students, and he would have to make alternate arrangements.
He wrote a book that I have in my library that I read very often called Black Robes
White Justice.
and White Justice.
Yeah.
He was vilified in the New York press because he was a strict believer in constitutional law. And as a judge, he exercised that.
And that
I had him for a class, Vaughn.
I see. And that spawned his nickname in New York, a very derisive nickname, Turn 'em Loose Bruce, because he strictly believed in the exclusion of evidence that was illegally obtained. If you had a defendant brought in front of him who was beaten bloody, and they claimed that the confession was voluntary, Bruce Wright would only have to question the defendant for 3 or 4 seconds and understand exactly what had gone on, and he'd throw the case out. And of course, he was despised for that.
By who?
By the New York PD and by the legal establishment in New York City. But Bruce Wright was unwavering, and eventually they maneuvered him off the criminal bench and put him
in civil court.
in civil court, maybe in the family law section, as I recall. But he was a man of strict principle and unwavering. And in fact, as a postscript to the Princeton story, he was awarded an honorary degree from Princeton in 1996. The students, when they found out about that story, were so incensed that they demanded that the university grant him an honorary degree and invite him to commencement and have him there as a speaker, which happened. He did. He came and was given his degree, the students apologized, saying, well, we know this is about 50 years too late, but,
Purdue did the same thing.
With Higginbotham? Yeah.
Yeah, not knowing, supposedly forgetting all about what happened, and invited him
Right.
to speak at the commencement of the law school there.
Yep. Well, this
See,
being...
I'm really incensed, Vaughn, and I'm being calm about this, about how black lawyers, not only by the establishment, but by our own people, are often ignored as being able to defend them and to take care of their needs and to do that. I mean, growing up in Philadelphia, we've talked about this many times.
Yep.
You were better off going to. And going into criminal court without a black lawyer, which has been proven on many occasions, much to the chagrin of society. That's another thing that annoys me, that Johnny Cochran never got his due.
Well, I think Johnny Cochran did get his due, although you still see him vilified on the internet. I don't understand, well, I do understand the wellspring of those sentiments, but, Johnny Cochran was a superb advocate. who did a magnificent job for his clients, which is what an attorney is supposed to do. I won't even get into the questions of whether O.J. did it or not. To me, that's beside the point. You still see the debate about it, and Johnny Cochran's name was dragged into the recent contretemps over O.J.'s book and TV show, you know, If I Did It, which I think is absurd.
Definitely, you know, and I agree with you. See, one of the things that bothered me.
But let me
Yeah,
finish
go
the
ahead.
thought. Let
Yeah,
me finish the
finish.
thought here. I think that people who make those kinds of ignorant comments simply do not understand the legal system. The bottom line in the O.J. Simpson case, irrespective of whether he did it or not, is that the prosecution absolutely blew that case. That was the problem with the case. The prosecutors blew it. End of story. You know, I think they were handed a slam dunk. They chose to tie their case to a lying, dirty cop. They were warned that Mark Fuhrman was a lying, dirty cop. They chose to ignore those warnings and tie the whole case to him, and he sank them. And that was the end of it, right there. You know, statistics show that in over 95% of cases where prosecutorial misconduct is shown, there are acquittals. I don't think the jury had a choice in that case but to acquit O.J. Simpson on the basis of perjured testimony.
Let me tell you what.
This cop sat before the jury and took the Fifth Amendment for a full day and a half. You know, basically what he said is, I lied under oath. And people expect a jury to ignore that and throw it out? That's absurd.
Let me tell you what I have a problem with, Vaughn. And around the same time, I watched a black man being beaten, and the cops that did the beating, it was justified in the courtroom. Those jurors sat there and watched that beating.
The Rodney King case?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Right.
And that's what I question. You know, when I see there's a project called the Innocent Project, is that what it's called?
The Innocence Project, yeah.
How many, not only black men, but white men, how many poor and black men and white men are walking out of jail?
On the basis of DNA evidence.
Right.
The question that I have, and the more telling question is, if all of these people are marching out of the jails and off death row on the basis of DNA evidence, how on earth did they get there in the first place? That's the question.
ID. And that, in 70% of the cases, because I have been following this case, it's ID. There's one famous case of this black guy who was ID'd by the white woman in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
The two of them now tour the country together. He spent 10 years. To another black man who was dying of cancer, DNA showed that he committed the crime and not this guy. There's another famed case that just came out recently of a guy in Texas, the same thing, where the lab and the prosecutorial tried, they just had it on American Justice this week, really tried to and the brilliant woman defense lawyer caught them at the game, and a woman with a conscience who was the head person there, she was a PhD, came out, who was from that lab, and came out and said that it was not true, the evidence that the forensics was showing, that it didn't scientifically apply, that she applied all these tests. And 6 months later, the Houston Police Department fired her. And so consequently, you know, prosecutorial and Chicago has one of the worst records.
Well, of course.
of beatings, of trials, and and remarkably, this Republican governor, Ryan, just stopped the death penalty altogether.
Well, of course, that's right. Because the list of abuses in the criminal justice system, the forced guilty pleas, the tainted convictions, were legend. And again, you know, you have to ask the question, if DNA evidence is the great exonerator, how on earth did all of these people get convicted in the first place?
Vaughn,
and, you know, I think
Vaughn,
you addressed that.
what do you think the chances?
And the question is really rhetorical, John.
Oh, okay.
I'm not asking.
Okay.
I know.
You're really talking about the injustices. I'm being a little dense this morning.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, because there's some huge problems in our criminal justice system,
Correct?
and Cruz leaks.
Yeah. Correct?
And one of the famous cases I grew up was the Scottsboro boys.
Mhm.
And black lawyers and white lawyers alike fought that case all the way up until I think the last of them died.
That's correct. For those who...
That's what I'm trying to bring out.
Well, for those who are unaware of history, the Scottsboro case was a 1930s case that arose in Alabama where 9 black youths were accused of raping 2 white women on a freight train. You know, it was during the Depression. There were hobo jungles around most rail yards. These young men had jumped the train, ranging in age, I can say, ranging in age from about 13 to 21, and they were going elsewhere to look for work. There were 2 white prostitutes who also happened to be on the train. They were all discovered there by the railroad detectives when the train pulled into a depot. The women subsequently claimed to have been raped, and the 9 Scottsboro boys were charged, tried, convicted in a very summary fashion, and sentenced to death. The death penalty was fought in the courts for years thereafter, and both women subsequently recanted their accusations under questioning after meeting the very famous religious scholar in New York, Harry Emerson Fosdick,
Yes.
who talked to them, and they recanted everything. So, you know, the whole thing had been a frame-up, and there were still those within the justice system who felt that the convictions and execution should be carried out in any case. In any event, it was a cause célèbre for many activists back in the 30s, and you know,
All the way up into the 40s.
yeah, until the last of the defendants died. Haywood Patterson, I think, was his name. Yeah, that's another part of 20th century history. But I'd like to shift gears. This is Black History Month, and I think we had an historic announcement this past weekend to the extent that Barack Obama announced his candidacy for President of the United States. I think that is a milestone in American history because for once there is a candidate who has a legitimate chance of winning the presidency. Jesse Jackson has run, Al Sharpton's run, Carol Moseley Braun has run. None of
And
those
Shirley Chisholm was the
and
first.
Shirley Chisholm, yeah, she was the first. None of those candidacies could be taken seriously. This one has to be taken seriously. And I'll just say that in terms of leadership, we can look at this man and there will not need, we won't need a suspension of disbelief. What do I mean by that? Americans suspended disbelief on 9/11 when they saw our current president sitting stunned in silence with a deer-in-the-headlights look in his eyes for 7 minutes after he had been informed that the second building had been hit by an airplane. Subsequent to that, he disappeared and was not seen by the American people for the remainder of that day. Even during the Battle of Britain, when London was being bombed by Nazi warplanes, the Queen Mother insisted on remaining in London at Buckingham Palace, which was a target, because she wanted to be a symbol for her people. She refused to be evacuated, and she wanted to be visible. This guy, our president, spent the remainder of that day running and hiding. Yet Americans bought the image 3 days later of the strong leader with the bullhorn at ground zero. A suspension of disbelief. Mission accomplished.
Okay.
Prancing around the deck of an aircraft carrier, dressed up in a flight suit, pretending to be Top Gun, when in fact, he ducked his generation's war. He ran and hid in the Air National Guard and didn't show up for a good part of that. But again, Americans suspended disbelief and accepted the image. And finally, there's the 9/11 Commission and his fear and refusal to go before that commission without Vice President Cheney. Yet, Americans bought the strong, decisive leader image. Again, a suspension of disbelief. Let me just cut to the chase and say this. With a man like Barack Obama, we will not need to suspend any kind of disbelief. He is what he is. I don't know, I'm not calling this an endorsement. What I'm saying is that you have two entirely different individuals here. And I hope people remember that. John?
I stay away from, I think the thing in this whole thing that bothers me is, one, his safety. Two, has America really gotten over its basic black and white color issues? And I'm not sure of that. Three, and I'm not endorsing anyone, because this show is not about endorsements. I'm worried about whether he'll get a fair shake in the press, but I'm worried about that with most people, because the distortions and with these bloggers and these misguided people on the internet, the whole thing that happened to me that triggered my senses when Biden made the stupid remark that he made. Because it is Black History Month, and I want to go back to that.
Well, what did Biden say that was so offensive?
The word articulate, for me, really annoys me, because I have thousands of black people that I know are absolutely articulate. And I've had it happen too many times to me when I've been speaking and someone have been telling me about, it's not a compliment to me to tell me how articulate I am.
Well, let me just back up here. Joseph Biden's office released to the New York Times a list of quotes in which he described any number of different people in praiseworthy terms. All of them were white, and he referred to them as articulate.
Vaughn, you're changing my subject, okay?
Well, I'm just clarifying.
That word annoys me, and I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm an independent. And so consequently, that word bothered me, because do I agree with Jesse Jackson? I found him to be very articulate. I don't agree with Al Sharpton all the time. I find him to be very articulate. Shirley Chisholm was articulate. And I really am bothered, and I wish, for me, there's a number of us Afro-Americans who don't find that a complimentary remark when you walk up and tell us how articulate we are.
Most people were offended by the term clean.
Yeah.
Al Sharpton called up Biden and said, well, I bathe every day. But we know, at least I know, what that meant. I think Senator Biden was simply saying the guy is not tainted by scandal. He's squeaky clean. I'm sure that's what he meant.
Yeah,
But,
listen,
you
I
know.
don't know what his intentions were.
But
I don't know why he had to make the statement in the first place. That's what bothered me. Why did he open up his mouth in the first place?
Well,
And Barack Obama doesn't need to be endorsed by Joe Biden to be a viable candidate. And if Joe Biden wanted to endorse Barack Obama, he should have went to somebody and asked their advice about how to do that. Because words in America have double and triple meanings, and how they're used. And, you know, I'm 71 years old and lived in this country my whole life, and I have watched the government, the media, play with words in a way that is absolutely different. And one of the things about being a veteran, and all vets, I was looking at Veterans for Peace not too long ago, which Ed Everett's a part of. And vets, all of us who have been sent to these places under false pretenses about pushing the American dream. And I'm talking about black history because I represent a people who are still struggling. We have made tremendous gains. I am not against integration, but I am against the kind of integration that I see being practiced today.
And what's that?
It's de facto integration. You know, you and I know that one of the most you know, even though 1954 was praised as this great thing happened, and the schools still aren't integrated. Education is still poor in the poorer neighborhoods. Right here in Vermont, you don't have to be black to get a bad education. You got to be poor and white to get a bad education. You know, so much of race and class are tied in together that the two become almost inseparable. One of my worries during Black History Month is how little we know, a lot of our folks know, about the kind of people that have made it possible for us to be at this place.
Let me just interject here. I don't think most people know that fully 1/3 of George Washington's troops at Yorktown were black. I don't think, a lot of people don't know that. But the Revolutionary War could not have been won without black volunteers who poured into the Army. At the end of the war, when many of the white volunteers had given up, were going back to their farms, were facing financial ruin, the black soldiers were fighting for freedom. They were promised freedom if they fought for the Continental Army.
Who built Washington, D.C.?
Black laborers. It was designed by Benjamin Banneker.
And he was what?
He was black.
Was he Afro-American?
He was Afro-American.
Mm.
But you know, there's a lot here that you know, unfortunately, black history really is American history, and you can't set aside 1 month of the year to highlight that.
I find it hard to talk about black history in just 28 days.
Well, yes, that's the shortest month of the year, correct. Yeah.
You have to wait every 4 years
Yeah.
to get to 29 days.
Yeah, you get that extra day every 4 years in a leap year. Correct.
You know, we are so much a part of the history of this country.
Well, we're an integral part of the history of the United States, and I think that so much of that has been obscured. Black history is American history.
Where was Alexander Hamilton born?
He was born in St. Kitts, I believe, and had black ancestry. His father was a Scottish Army officer. His mother was a local woman. You know, I don't know that he ever acknowledged black ancestry, but people on St. Croix, where he grew up, certainly identified him in that way.
So there's all these mysteries around.
Well, that's correct.
You know, and so that's my point, and I think that those of us who are well-versed and well-read, that we, you know, and that's why the Minority Report becomes important, because we talk about Afro-Americans throughout the year, because there's so many contributions, medicine. You know, I'm always discovering something. I didn't realize that a black doctor in the Midwest who couldn't get admitted to Harvard Medical School, Vaughn, this one is one of those stories that you tell, You know, he was not that kind of medicine. You know, he was the other kind, you know, right? But he was, you know,
What was his name?
Julian.
Oh, Percy Julian, the
Yes.
famous chemist, of course.
Yeah. You
He-
never hear him talked about.
No, no. Well, in Chicago growing up, we heard about him, but mainly in the context of his having purchased a house in Oak Park, which was then an all-white suburb of Chicago, and having his house repeatedly firebombed
Right.
by the locals who were unhappy with his being there, and his sitting out on his veranda night after night with a loaded shotgun in order to protect his house and family from the locals.
Yeah. But he put something on the market.
Yes, he did.
Cortisone.
He developed cortisone and any number of other pharmaceutical remedies. He's very famous.
And he was at a very small university in the Midwest.
Which one was that?
DePauw.
Oh, DePaul University in Indiana. That's right.
Yeah. Because he could have found it hard to get jobs
Right.
to do what he wanted.
Yeah. Well, there's a famous story about him doing a training film for a pharmaceutical company, and he was showing them how an injection needed to be performed with cortisone and one of his other developments. And the film was stopped, and he was told to put on gloves so that the film viewers would not see his hands, which were black, at which point he told them all to go to hell and continued with the film.
I have to laugh. You know, I think that's the other thing is that I love about African Americans. We can laugh. You know,
Yes.
because you know it's ironic at times. It's cynical, but you know, I look around. In the 71 years that I've been on this earth, there was never a time that when I read the black newspaper from Chicago,
The Chicago Defender.
yeah, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Philadelphia Tribune were papers that I read weekly.
The Amsterdam News.
Amsterdam News
In New
once in a
York.
while,
Yep.
because there was a big fight between Philly and New York.
Right.
But the Pittsburgh Courier was the big one,
Yep.
with the big circulation, and Chicago Defender, and consequently, you know, I'm reading this article about Julian, and that's one that got away from me. I remembered him for the Oak Park incident, because that was in all the newspapers.
Correct.
But they never talked about his academic accomplishments and scientific accomplishments. See, that's the other thing that goes on. And then my favorite is always with Charles Drew,
Yep. Correct.
who probably made the biggest contribution in medicine over the last 50, 60 years. Plasma,
Blood plasma.
yes.
Yes.
How many lives, I mean, would have been lost in the Second World War, and consequently, is there a major operation in this country performed without the blood being there?
Without blood transfusions.
Yes.
Correct.
And so, you know, and
And
then
he also developed a system of storage of blood
right,
plasma
that's right.
so that it could be transported to the military hospitals and to the war front during World War II. He's an amazing, amazing man.
Then there's Ralph Bunche. Nobody talks about Ralph Bunche.
He won the Nobel Peace Prize, I think 1949 or 1950, for his negotiation of the Arab-Israeli crisis. And of course, history has shown us how successful that was in the long term.
You mean he actually went in and talked to the warring factions?
Yes, he did.
Oh, really? That seemed to have escaped our State Department today.
Well, we have a State Department today that believes that military force is the answer to everything. And of course, that we're seeing that being put to the lie every day in Iraq. So but that's a different story.
Yeah, you know, and the Obama thing is that I'm watching with great interest. I am watching this whole thing unfold with great interest. I find the statements made by some Afro-Americans stupid also about Obama. I mean, have we forgot their skin color? No. Diallo was an African kid who was shot 41 times in New York because his complexion was wrong. You pointed out the kids in Queens were shot because their complexion was wrong.
Yes.
You just pointed out another one in New York just occurred, right?
Yes. There was an incident involving 4 black youths who were sitting in a car. It was a case of mistaken identity. The plainclothes police approached the car, guns drawn, and these young people didn't know what to make of it. They thought they were being carjacked because they'd done nothing wrong. They rolled down the windows and they got out of the car. They were grabbed and roughly handled. Come to find out, all 4 of these black youths were students at Yale. They were in Manhattan to make a film, and they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and were misidentified. That could have been an awful, awful tragedy.
Well, you're a father of 2 boys. Does that thought never not enter your mind?
Every day. I think about
That's why
I think about it every day.
That's what I meant by de facto integration, Vaughn.
Yeah.
I'm the father of a son and 2 grandsons.
You mean de jure integration.
Right.
De facto is, you know, as things exist. This is the fact. But yes, it's something you have to consider. And I was struck by something that Michelle Obama, Barack Obama's wife, said on television last night during the interview. They were both being interviewed, and she was asked, "Do you fear for his safety? Are you afraid that something might happen to him?" And she said, "We cannot live our lives in fear. My husband is a black man in America. He could just as easily be shot going to the gas station."
And for no good reason,
Yeah, there you go.
other than he's black.
Yeah.
Getting back to the black lawyers, because I want to go back to black lawyers and black judges. I've read some books recently Higginbottom has written that Larry McCrory gave me.
Yeah, one is called In the Matter of Color.
Right.
Excellent book.
And where he really does, and it's a really interesting book to read because he really goes back into the 17th and 18th century. That's the other book that he,
Right, yes.
about how the law was used
Yes.
and constantly manipulated and changed.
Yep.
You know, we got to that. What do you think are some of the landmark cases that involve black Americans?
What do I think of some of
Yeah.
the landmark cases?
Yeah.
I think that they were decisions of convenience. I think that the Dred Scott case back in 1858, in which the Supreme Court declared that black Americans, even free ones, had no rights which white citizens were bound to respect. I think that was merely a reflection of the time rather than a statement of the law. There are a number of other cases.
Was there one in 1897?
Plessy v. Ferguson was the one in 1897 regarding segregated facilities, and that gave us separate but equal. I think that you know, the language in those cases was very slippery and, of course, resoundingly dishonest. But it was a reflection of society at the time rather than the law as it was written on the books.
And the Supreme Court, up until Roosevelt, was usually driven by the politics of the time, wasn't it?
Well, they've always been driven by the politics of the time.
Thank you.
You know, Brown versus Board of Education could never have been decided as it was prior to that time. The only reason Brown versus Board of Education was decided as it was was because of the Cold War and because the United States was fighting a communist ideology all over the world, and you could not very well hold up democracy as a shining example of a political system as long as you had the stain and the shame of segregation. And it was a politically driven decision because it would have been indefensible in the broader context of the Cold War. That's the only reason Brown versus Board of Education was decided the way it was.
So, and this is what I'm getting to, jurisprudence can be pretty tricky at times, can't it?
It's always tricky.
Thank you. That's the point that I'm making. So you mean they can be driven by their own personal beliefs?
Absolutely. I mean, it's impossible, really, to separate the judiciary from the political dynamic. The political dynamic is always a part of it. Look at the most recent example, Bush v. Gore. What is that? I mean, it was one of the most intellectually dishonest pieces of sophistry I have ever read in my life. I consider it the equivalent of a judicial one-night stand on the part of those 5 justices who voted in that case the way they did.
Don't hold back, Vaughn.
Well, I'm not going to bite my tongue about that. I think it was intellectually dishonest, and I think it was a disgrace. But it was clearly a politically motivated decision, no doubt about that.
Well, I'm going to criticize something else that really annoys me. And I know you're not a big fan of the justice he replaced, but the fact that he replaced this justice is just annoys me every time I look at that court. I can't even bear to look at that court picture.
You are speaking of Justice Clarence Thomas?
Yes.
Ah, yes.
I can't think of a more ill-prepared, less aware human being getting that seat. That Leon Higginbottom was passed over in favor of this man is just one of the great, great tragedies, as far as I'm concerned, we as a people have suffered.
Well, Leon Higginbotham, for all of his distinguished service on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, was considered to be 2 things at the time that appointment was made. 1, they said he was too old. 2, they said he was too liberal. End of story. But I don't even get to the personality or the judicial philosophy of a Clarence Thomas.
What is his judicial philosophy?
Well, I think he's an ideologue. He talks about this thing called natural law. But let's look at it this way. Supreme Court justices are frequently pulled from the ranks of academia. Distinguished academics, such as Justice Stephen Breyer, who was my teacher at Harvard Law School. He was appointed as a distinguished academic. Was Clarence Thomas a distinguished academic? Absolutely not. Or you can pull a justice from the ranks of distinguished practitioners.
I don't know anything he was distinguished in law.
Let me finish. A la Lewis Powell, who was a distinguished corporate practitioner.
Right.
Or you can appoint a justice from the ranks of the existing judiciary. Was Clarence Thomas a distinguished jurist? Absolutely not. He had barely been on the D.C. Court of Appeals for 2 years. He's nothing more than an ideologue and the worst kind of token, and I think he knows it. And I think that his appointment is not just a disgrace to the memory of a Thurgood Marshall, the man he replaced, but I think it's an insult to the meanest intelligence for anybody to say that this man is qualified to sit on the Supreme Court. Absolutely not.
That's my point. I mean, what did he do before that? The head of the FCC?
He was the head of the EEOC.
There you are.
He was a career bureaucrat.
Thank you.
And no Supreme Court justice has ever been taken from the ranks of the career bureaucrats.
Of the civil servants.
Of the civil servants. But it was clear what that was. It was a cynical, very badly motivated appointment, and it was done with glee. I think that, you know, the margin of the vote in the Senate, 52 to 48, one of the closest in history, is a telling statement of just how poor that appointment really was. And he's done nothing to distinguish himself on the Supreme Court bench since that time.
Has he ever written a book?
Not that I know of.
Has he ever written any distinguished papers that he's known for?
No.
Was he ever a professor in a law school?
No. Was he ever a distinguished practitioner? No. In fact, his record at Yale Law School was so poor that no law firm in America would hire him. So how did this man get to the Supreme
Reagan
Court?
hired him. The Reagan administration hired him.
Well, he had a mentor.
Yes.
He had the Senator Danforth, the senator from Missouri, was a mentor. But strictly on the merits, absolutely not. I can point to a dozen highly distinguished black jurists who would have been better choices for the Supreme Court. But that's another story.
I want to talk about one of my favorites, Randall Robinson.
Randall Robinson is an internationally renowned human rights activist. He is also a close personal friend. He was a mentor and big brother to me at Harvard Law School. He was a year ahead of me.
He's a distinguished writer, too.
He's a fabulous writer. He is a selfless man. He has given up so much in the cause of international human rights. I think that his books should be read by every thinking American because he tells a story of America that is very rarely told. And I'll leave it at that. His latest book is titled Quitting America.
Quitting America.
He has left America and gone into self-imposed exile in the Caribbean.
He lives on St. Kitts, doesn't he?
St. Kitts, Nevis, somewhere there, yeah. But in the book, he tells why he left America. And I think it's important for every thinking American to know why.
And you also feel his pain.
Well, there's tremendous pain.
Yeah.
You know, he didn't want to leave his homeland.
When I became aware of him, really was his fight for South Africa.
Yeah, the anti-apartheid battles in South Africa was what he was noted for. And he gave up everything for that. He was offered millions of dollars to become a network anchorman, to become a pitchman, to become a spokesman for this or that. He turned it all down. He said he did not wish to be compromised.
He had the integrity of a giant.
Yes, he did.
I think the other person, when I speak of South Africa, I just read a very interesting article about Ashe.
Arthur Ashe, the tennis great and human rights activist.
It doesn't seem like 14 years he's been dead, you know.
No, it does not.
He's so young.
He was only 49 years old at the time.
In his prime.
Yeah, and
I think of he and Randall alike, because they really, Randall first and he second. You know, when he went there and played and refused to play before a second, remember that?
Yes. He refused to play before a segregated crowd in South Africa at the South African Open Tennis Tournament.
And what he meant to the South Africans.
Yeah.
Kids in South Africa still talk about that they had never seen a black man walk around.
Yeah.
Signing autographs and...
Free.
Free.
They had never seen a free black man. That's what they said.
You know, 5 minutes.
Yeah, well.
You know, and I take that with something because I look at you and you at the end of it, and myself and Larry and all blacks born in a certain period of time as survivors of a really harsh apartheid system that existed here in this country. And what we did in spite of that. And I think it is as heroic as Gandhi in India. And that's what I mean, Vaughn, when I talk about this Black History Month. That's why I'm annoyed by it. Because
Well-
there's not a time that we gave in that we weren't struggling against slavery and segregation.
Well, it all brings to mind a very interesting conversation that Thurgood Marshall had with his fellow justices before he died.
I think I know the one. Go ahead, tell us, because you tell it better than I do.
The other justices were troubled by race-based affirmative action. And, you know, the issue was, well, how long should we expect it to last? It can't last in perpetuity. There has to be some sunset provision or some end, some finite endpoint to it. You know, Justice O'Connor said, well, perhaps 25 years, and they batted that about, and finally Thurgood Marshall interrupted the conversation, and he said, answer me this, how long did we have slavery and segregation in this country? And the justices were baffled. And Justice Marshall said, 360 years. He said, so I think that a period of 360 years of affirmative action should just about do it. Which I thought was a wonderful answer.
See, today you made a statement to me about America's thinking. 2 minutes. And I'm going to close the program with that, because I think this is an important thought. And when I hear young and blacks today and so forth, we haven't caught up. It is impossible to close the gap of 360 years in the very short time. I'm not making excuses. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I'm hoping that the next program that Vaughn and I do will be more specific about some issues around Black history that he and I have talked about off the camera. But Black history is not this 28-day period out of the month. Black history, we live and breathe it. Every time we walk out of our houses, we are contributing to Afro-American history. Duke Ellington, there's a name. Right down the line, there is nothing about this culture that we haven't contributed. I am so proud to be an Afro-American. I'm proud to have Vaughn Carney for my friend.
Likewise, it's mutual.
And then I want to mention our allies, like the Ed Everetts of the world.
Thank you, Ed.
And
a
the Phil
big
Hobbs.
shout out to Ed Everetts.
And the William Lloyd Garrisons, who were really behind the emancipation of the slaves. So if you don't want to know about American history, read about William Lloyd Garrison. On that note, I want to thank you for your kindness. Feel free to get in touch with either one of us. But the next show will be more specific about some figures in history that he and I will agree on. We fight all the time, but we love each other, because in good intellectual fights is growth. And I want to sign off now.
Thank you, and good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Welcome to the Peace and Justice Review, a weekly program dedicated to examining important issues involving human rights, economic and social justice, the environment, and struggles for peace around the world. This program is sponsored by the Peace and Justice Center, which works to create a just, peaceful, and ecologically healthy world through education, advocacy, training, and nonviolent activism. Please drop by and visit the Peace and Justice Center, store, and resource library at 21 Church Street in Burlington, or call 863-2345 to find out more about how to get active in your world.
You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one.
Hello. My name is John Tucker, and we are about to do the 20th show entitled The Minority Report. With me this afternoon is Dr. McCrory, who you have seen on this show many times with me. As this is the 20th show, I want to make a short statement. Civil rights is not a spectator sport. Civil rights needs people who are dedicated and have dedicated full time to the issues of civil rights. Civil rights is not a one-issue sport. It's not just about education. It's not just about better jobs. Civil rights covers a wide spectrum of things, and especially when it talks about people of color in the United States, basically Afro-Americans. The other thing that I want to say is Afro-Americans through the years have elected their own leaders. The media and NGOs cannot pick Afro-American leaders for Afro-Americans. That just can't happen. Afro-Americans have picked their own leaders for many hundreds of years in this country. And those of you who are engaged in that activity really need to check yourselves and stop trying to play our community by engaging in these activities. The average Afro-American does not care what the outside world thinks of their leaders. They care about their leaders. There are 42 Afro-American leaders in Congress right now, elected by black majorities to be congressmen and so forth, which will lead me into today's subject. As you know, a young man of African descent who's Afro-American because he was born here in America is decided that he was going to throw his hat in the ring and run for president. I myself, as a black American, have a huge concern. One, for his safety. Two, for his well-being. And three, because of the fact that given what happened in Tennessee when Harold Ford ran for the state Senate, where out in the open he had a margin of victory, but things changed when white people went into those polling booths and could vote in secret, that we wouldn't know what their individual votes were. And clearly the best man did not win the Senate seat in Tennessee. Barack Obama is as good a candidate as there is among the Democrats right now, as I can see, in the primaries, because he comes with no baggage. To say that he's inexperienced really bothers me. He has as much, if not more, experience than George Bush did when he was elected president of the country. And already the sniping at him has started by the press, by the other candidates. And I look and I say, what are they so threatened by? Are they threatened by the fact that he has new ideas, that he's not tainted by political scandal, that he doesn't belong to any one branch of the American people? Or underneath it all, are they really upset by the fact that he's the wrong color? Dr. McCrory, I'm going to stop right there.
That's a nice place to stop. I have the same concerns that you have, John, and maybe a few more, although I don't think that I'm thinking anything that you haven't already thought about. I'm concerned about his safety too, because America has a way of dealing with black people who don't fit their particular model, and that is to destroy them. So I'm concerned about his safety. I'm concerned about all the things that you've already mentioned. I'm concerned about another one, and as I said earlier, I'm sure that you've thought about this too, and that is that if you look at Obama, he actually is highly qualified for this job, perhaps more than anybody of recent vintage. He really is qualified in so many ways, it's not even funny. And one could list all of those. On the other hand, is it possible, and this is my big question, is it possible to carry the feelings that one has about various issues into a presidential campaign in this country and not be tainted by special interest groups? In other words, could he in fact say what he might want to say about Israel? I'm not sure he could. Could he say about many things like this, about the Palestinians and so forth and so on? I think that the system is so structured that one almost has to join forces with some things that one wants no part of. And that's what really worries me. Whereas if he were just a senator or some other person of power, but not going for a presidency, he could at least voice his views openly and without too much concern about serving the people, whatever that means.
Yeah,
and I'm worried about that.
I am concerned about that, all those things that you listed, because America is a construct of money.
Exactly.
America is constructed on money. There was a time when things in America like integrity counted. Integrity and accountability were issues in America that stopped being issues after 1946 and 47 in this country, and the country started to shift into this me first. You know, it was very seldom that you could be in America through the 50s and not met a young man who hadn't served in the armed forces, whether he was well off or poor.
Right.
Because most Americans were committed to protecting this country. Now, what we have gotten is this two-tier system that exists. You know, it was interesting. This morning I was listening to the British right now are talking about something that affects them. One of their princes is serving in Baghdad right now in the army.
Right.
Hell, we got 2 draft dodgers running the country.
Yeah, it's a whole different bag.
You know, I mean, you know, who swagger around on top of other people's blood, giving out all these platitudes about war. You know, I can't think of 2 less deserving people than George Bush and Dick Cheney to be issuing these kind of platitudes. We got a Senate and a House where not many people in those things. One senator of prominence that I can think of, 2 of them, Joe Biden and Jim Webb. Jim Webb currently has a son who's serving in Iraq, and Joe Biden had a son who was there. And so consequently, I worry about Obama because, like you said, I mean, there's 2 Americas out there right now that have really begun to separate themselves. And the haves can run around mouthing all the platitudes. And then the other concern that I have is there's a few black folks that have trickled into that point of other people serving at their hand. The current Secretary of State being one of them that I'm thinking of, the justice on the Supreme Court, who are part of that power group, who send young men and young women off to war, and who let the racism in this country, and racism does exist in this country, and exist in a very different way. You and I were talking about this earlier. White people have learned the business of political, what's the word that I'm searching for?
Correctness.
Political correctness. But how do they really talk when we're not around?
Yes.
What do they really say? And that's what Harold Ford learned in Tennessee. Out in the open, Harold Ford was the candidate. How do you answer that?
There's no answer. I mean, there is an answer, and we all know what it is. But can you just imagine what people are saying about Obama?
Oh, God.
Can you just imagine it?
My stomach.
Even the people who are walking around saying, oh, he's a wonderful candidate. Oh, I'd love to hear him speak. Oh. But can you imagine what's being said?
I am so...
And I can tell you what's being said, but I don't have to because you know it.
And when there's smiling faces in the media, you know, and then there's the ones who can't stop themselves. Chris Matthews being one. Chris Matthews cannot stand the fact that Obama is running for president. I mean, it just drives him crazy.
I mean, how many ethnicities or in any other way cultural or racial backgrounds are being mentioned about all these this multitude
None.
of candidates?
Only him.
Okay, why?
Because he's black.
Yeah, I know.
Well,
Well, that's the point. I'm answering your question.
that's right. And that is
My
always.
God, I mean, it was as if, well, it's very sad. It's very sad, but that is the country that we live in. And that's what we, people like you and I, have had to put up with all of our lives.
Yeah, but what do we do with these black people running around here who let white people say that they're our leaders, who are catering to this?
We have to keep doing what you just did a little while ago, and that is to say that these people do not tell us who our leaders are. Who our leaders are. They cannot have that power, and that's all there is to it. And it's a continuing fight, and we're going to have to fight these people. If you saw The Covenant, which I'm sure you did, the other night on television, which I thought was an incredibly well-produced, well-done program. And
On C-SPAN.
On C-SPAN.
Yes.
And Tavis Smiley and
Tom Joyner.
Tom Joyner deserve so much credit for that, because that's what white America needs to see and needs to understand about this country. But at any rate, if you remember that, there was a woman there, I've forgotten her name, I'm sorry, who talked about black leaders and leading blacks and the difference
Hearn.
between the two.
Sandra Hearn.
Yeah,
that's what
okay.
it was.
And
Yeah.
it was just wonderful. It was just wonderful.
She was the one
black
that also
leaders
talked-
are those people that we, the black community, choose to be our leaders. And leading blacks are the people that the media choose to be our leaders. And we can't accept that, and we must fight it and fight it and fight it. And
I
that's the
bet
answer to your question.
Bruce Gordon runs an organization of 400,000 people. He's the chairman and CEO of the NAACP. He's a black leader.
He was brilliant, incidentally. I mean, on this program we're talking about, he was absolutely first rate. And I'm proud. I'm proud to have him as one of our
Yes.
leaders.
Jesse Jackson is still a black leader.
Of course.
No matter how the press wants to vilify him, how much some black people want to vilify him, a majority of black people still see Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton as leaders. Now, for those middle-class blacks that cannot take that and think that they're too harsh and too outspoken in their condemnation, see, to be involved in civil rights, you can't look for the right thing to say when you answer the kind of racism that black people in America have faced. I know right now in Vermont that there are people who despise me. Because for the last 11 or 12 years in Vermont, I have done nothing but civil rights work. They push me aside. They don't want to hear what I have to say. But in the end, the truth is the hardest thing to take. Because black leaders will not shirk the truth when it comes to civil rights.
Of course.
And you can't be polite about it.
Well, you see, that's one of the things that I'm talking about. I mean, here comes an Obama who understands these issues very well, incidentally, even though he was actually raised as a white person. I mean, if you look at his background, he was actually raised by a white family and so forth and so on. I'm not trying to put that down. What I'm saying is that he understands these things because in the United States, of course, one drop of black blood makes you black. And so you either have to understand these things or you won't survive.
He also chose to live his life out with a black woman.
Absolutely.
He also chose to spend most of his career on the south side of Chicago as an activist. And that's why I say that
Working on social issues which primarily dealt with black people.
that's right.
Of course.
That's why I say of
Highly
all-
qualified,
That's why I
believe me.
say he's highly qualified among the presidency, because I can't pick one person who has worked on the front line in America's poorest neighborhoods, working with poor people. And I'm talking about even poor white people. I would be pleased. John Edwards comes to the closest to that description. I am tired of well-fed, well-positioned white men and white women constantly putting this country in danger. And my sensibilities tell me that one day the poor white America is going to wake up and face that they've been played and they've been had. Because your NGOs aren't always the ones who are going to look out for your best interest either, because they play you all the time.
You know, what you're saying is one of the saddest things about this country, and that is the inability, the historical inability of poor whites and black people to get together.
Absolutely.
I mean, think of what a force that would have been could that happen. And you know, it was so orchestrated. I mean, I could tell you stories about it that'll make you cry, for goodness sake.
No, you're absolutely right. The white power structure works very hard. Their government, their NGOs, all work very hard not to see that happen. They can't afford to have that happen, because if that happens, they may be out of a job.
Yes, absolutely, and would be. There's no question about that. Unfortunately, though, it isn't going to happen. It isn't going to happen. And that's very sad. That's why I'm saying it's one of the saddest things about this whole business.
Oh, yeah.
Because they have so much in common, it's not even funny. And if they could just knock down the racism that is involved in that and get together as a political force, it would just be incredible. I mean, all of us would feel a better country. All of us would have a better way of life. And can't do it.
No,
We can't do it.
Western democracy is not set up for that to happen.
Well, okay. And so that's why this presidency thing becomes so tenuous. I mean, it's I don't know the extent to which an Obama can push an agenda which is in any way aimed at black people. In any way. I don't care how much, in any way. And other things. I mean, not just black people, but an agenda which really has in it the threads of a whole new society, of a whole new sociology, and so forth and so on. I don't know how far one can go. And that worries me, because here is a person who has the potential for doing all of that. But he's caught in a system which doesn't allow things like that. And of course, you have a candidate sitting right next to him who can change her mind just like that about what she wants to support. Now, I don't
You
want to
know-
get into the politics of that to that
You
level.
know, and I was thinking about that, the tragedy of womanhood in America in particular. When I look around the world and I see women engaged in positions of power in other countries, Germany, for a fact, has a German chancellor. Pakistan has had 2 women prime ministers. India has had a woman prime minister and so forth. Liberia in Africa has a woman president. And you know, one of the things that probably, and Obama's another issue, but is when are white women in particular, because I think black women understand better than white women the power construct of this country, when are white women going to assert themselves and push themselves into positions of leadership that mean great changes not only for women, but for people in general? And consequently, I haven't seen that happen. And I found it interesting that the people that start sniping at him first is her campaign. A man in California who is a political fundraiser raised money at his home so that he could back Obama, then gives an interview to a leading reporter for the New York Times, Maureen O'Dowd, where he makes some uncomplimentary comments about the Clintons and how disappointed, because he was a big supporter of the Clintons.
Right.
What got me is the innate racism of the Clintons' response. And when have you, anybody, ever heard in this country of a candidate being asked to give back money because somebody made an flattering statement about one of their opponents? In that reeks the worst kind of racism, and this is how white America thinks. Get that money back, boy. How dare you keep that money when he's insulted me? Because the same rules don't apply to us.
That is correct.
All the things you've been saying
will.
about Obama,
That's right.
those rules don't apply to him. And when are they going to play the white woman card like they did on Harold Ford? You know, they did that to Harold Ford.
Yes.
And I was impressed by his wife, who I saw in 60 Minutes. And when she talked, and and it amazed me that 60 Minutes really didn't know that he was in danger when he walked out the house or when he was driving his car, like any other black man in America is. And that's the thing she pointed out. She said if he wasn't running for president, I still had to worry about him when he walks out the house. Because that, my friend, lies at the cause problem in America. And that's why the Black Covenant, which you brought up this past weekend, which was on the air, is so important. And it's a shame that not many black people in Vermont saw this.
Well, I'm sorry that everybody didn't see it. You mentioned walking out of the house and the fear of so forth, and all I can think about is Medgar Evers. And of course, Mrs. Evers, whatever her name is now, was on that program that we're talking about. Incredibly important person in the political and social structure of this country.
Yeah, but we're talking about leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer and so
of
forth.
Of course.
Who black people appointed as leaders. Because when black people have moved forward in this country is when their own leaders emerged. The Rosa Parks emerged. Martin emerged. SNCC emerged. You know, all those things emerged from black people themselves doing it. White people have never picked a leader for us that made a difference. Marcus Garvey.
Well, you know, you're making, without even trying to, you're making an important other point. And that is, yes, those are the leaders and those are very important people in this whole struggle. On the other hand, they couldn't do it by themselves. The fact that Rosa Parks didn't get up out of her seat was not enough. That thing was so highly structured, and that was brought up in that program.
That's right.
This thing was so highly structured, and it was the people, the involvement of the people, the fact that they boycotted those buses, and they walked to work, and they did. And you started the program off by saying it is not a spectator sport.
That's right.
And you're right.
That's
You're
right.
right. If all of us are not involved in this thing, then nothing is going to happen.
That's right.
No matter what kind of leadership we have. So it's absolutely essential that
It's imperative.
everybody take part in this whole business.
It's imperative. It's imperative to the very issue we're talking about. Because somewhere along the way, we've been waylaid. We've been sidetracked. And I was impressed by the lead singer for Public Enemy, Chuck D. As a rapper, he was there. And what I found more about Public Enemy, because I don't like most rap, about Public Enemy was that they reminded me of the Last Poets.
Yes.
And consequently, and he made some important issues. He said, wearing a big silver thing around your neck don't make you a star. Because if you listen to Public Enemy, they made albums that directly affected the construct of racism in America and the plight of black people without all the other garbage that goes on in rap. It is the only album that I have by rappers, and it's called Public Enemy. And they remind me of the Last Poets. There is a movement in this country, but it hasn't hit Vermont, of black people really taking on this new racism and this new bigotry that exists in America today. Now, I don't know what makes it impossible in Vermont to take this on. Are we so outnumbered that we can't speak up and speak the truth?
No, I don't. See, I have a different take on that. And it's not that it's different, but it's a little, well, let's say it's different. And that is this. I think it has hit Vermont. I think it's hit the kids of Vermont because the kids listen to all that stuff that you're talking about. The problem is they don't understand it. These young kids don't understand it. They have no concept of the history, for example, of black people and the history of racism in this country. There is a profound ignorance in the state of Vermont.
Well, I went to a thing Saturday night, the Gospel Fest, and one of the things that I found the best about, the whole program, the first half of the program for me was just excellent, is the kids' choir came out, and when two young people got up and talked about how spirituals and gospels that were very at the heart of our movement in this country,
Right.
and slavery and how it started. And I said, how wonderful to hear a 12 and a 13-year-old say these kind of things, because that said to me that there were black people who were young black people, younger than me, who were raising their children to understand the historical ramifications of our music, of our movement, that we never were willing slaves. We were never the happy slave. It goes against our grain. And so consequently, that's another thing that has to be wiped out. They showed that damn movie last night on TV, Gone with the Wind. And if there's a movie that I despise, it's Gone with the Wind. The happy slave.
Yeah, the picture of the happy darky, of course. I mean, and that has to be dispelled. And the point that I'm trying to make is that neither in black kids or white kids in Vermont is there any real movement to dispel those myths. And there is a profound ignorance at that level. Now, fortunately, many of the black kids have parents who, like you and I, were hell-bent to make sure that our kids understood racism,
See?
understood our history and so forth. But that's not all of us.
But Larry, and I'm gonna say this, until white people are truthful, until political correctness is thrown out, until there are real meaningful subjects, white kids are still going to be polluted by their white parents. Because no matter how much they stand in our face and tell us this is terrible and oh, that's awful and oh, I just hate that. What happens when there's 35 of them in a room and no black people?
John, you won't get an argument out of me. I feel that way so strongly, it makes me cry. As an educator, it makes me cry. But that's the reality
As
of,
a human-
of what we're dealing with.
See, I think educator, human being,
That's
and
the
the whole
reality
thing
of what we're dealing
is
with.
that we are talking about a really, 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 really hot issue. A young woman not too long ago was on Paula Zahn, a young white woman who had done research about this, and some young white kids across the country, some 1,000 of them, let her read their personal diaries. She was shocked by the racism that existed in
Yeah,
those
of
personal
course.
diaries.
Of course.
And so consequently, our mistake as black people is not giving white people the answers that they should have as opposed to ones we think will make them feel better. And I see black people doing that all the time in Vermont. Not wanting to hurt white people's feelings. How can, if you're more interested in crushing your spirit by not hurting their feelings and taking away your pride and your sense of being because we need to be friends or we need to make them happy in the middle of their bigotry. Because that's what we do when we do that. And I've seen it happen time after time up here.
You listen, you get no argument from me. None whatsoever. If you look at the persistence of racism, the one underlying fact of all that is that racism is, there's no gene for racism. It has to be taught. And until parents are as abhorred by that as I am, then it's going to remain. It
Brother?
is taught over and over and over again. It's carried on from one generation to the next, and that's the way it is. And until white people are as upset about those attitudes in their children, then it will continue. And there's nothing you can do about it.
But in the Black Covenant, one of the things that was said was that black people's responsibility in that whole issue is that they don't play into making just what I said.
I'm not arguing with you about that.
And we do it. And I see our people do it all the time.
You see some of our people do it all the
A
time.
lot of them.
Okay, all right, okay.
A lot of them.
I've never seen you do it, and you've never seen me do it.
No.
Okay, all right.
But you know that it happens.
Of course I know that.
You,
it happens.
how long did you work at that university?
Yeah, 40 years.
How many times did you see it happen at that
John, I
university?
could tell you stories that would make you cry. I'm serious. In fact, they make me cry still. And I've been retired for almost 10 years now, and I still cry about some of the things
See, it's one thing
that I went through and that I saw black kids going through.
See, it's one thing for me to attack white people about their internalized bigotry and racism. But it's more important for me to tell black people that you need to stand up and be heard about your rights. And I remember you were at that hearing when we were doing the whole thing on the school report has been put aside. That was done 8 years ago.
Do you know
When
how
that
much-
black parent came forward
Do you
and
know
said,
how much effort went into that?
Absolutely.
Do you know how much
Yeah.
stomach we left
Yeah.
behind?
well, let me finish. I didn't want to make the white people dislike my child more, and so they let their child be insulted. This was a black parent that said that.
I know that, John. I know that.
You know, I can't blame white people for black people's refusal to stand up and be heard. And it's like
That's not, I think you're missing my point.
Bruce Gordon talked about it, and you and I were talking about
point.
it. Accountability.
Because, yes, and black people have to be accountable for the very thing you're talking about. But there is also a white component in this thing.
I didn't say
And
it.
white people have to get to the place where racism disturbs them so much that they want to see it ridded, that they want to rid themselves
My-
of it and their children of
Here's
it.
my point. I don't
And if
disagree.
that doesn't happen.
I don't disagree with you about
Well,
that.
then let's stop it then.
No, let's don't stop it because what I'm
No,
saying
let's
is
stop it. Let's
black
stop
people
looking
need-
like we're disagreeing because we are.
Okay, because black people, I'm saying black people can't give up the point of pushing white people to that point all the time.
I know it, and I agree with it.
That's
I
my
agree with
point.
it. There's a responsibility
On both sides.
on both sides
Yeah.
of this.
Absolutely.
And I don't want either one of them to fall away. And I want to remind both of them, black people or so-called black people, Negroes is what I'd rather call them, but that's beside the point. Black people, but also white people. Both of them have a responsibility to wipe out racism and wipe it out forever. And until we learn that we must do that, then there's no hope. I mean, you talk about this report on education. When I think of the tears, when I think of the struggles that we made, when I think of all the effort that went into trying to uncover and get rid of the racism in public education in Vermont, and to realize that we made almost no progress at all.
And what happened after that is, again, white people went ahead and put a black person in
Yeah, I know. Believe me.
who didn't do anything,
Believe me.
you know, and so-called white allies did that.
Yeah, I know.
And that's how far their racism goes, because they really know among us who is going to do the better job. The same thing happened in the school district here in Burlington and all over this state. And the report sits there. And a follow-up report showed that not much progress was made. You and I were in a high school a year and a half ago, and we figured out then. And black people were part of the problem then. So consequently, this thing of racism, some black people are like some of those black slaves who turned in Nat Turner and went into the boss's chamber, and the boss is sick and said, "We sick, boss?"
They trying to burn down our house.
Yeah,
They trying to burn down our house, boss.
yeah.
Our house.
And that mentality
Well,
is as dangerous to
well,
us.
John, I mean, you're right, and I'm not arguing with you.
No, we're not arguing.
I understand it. I understand how it came about, and I understand why it's still there. But all I'm saying is we have two fights.
Absolutely.
We have two fights, and we have to make both of them. We have to make both of them, and somebody has to stand. I mean, if we who understand these things don't stand up against them, who in the world will? And that's what they were saying in the covenant.
Yeah, the covenant, and you know, this tragedy about the covenant is going to be at Harvard Law School, April 6th and 7th, open to the public. And I'm going to be interested to see how many black people from this state show up down there for that. Because this group of black people are black people unlike ones that exist here, that aren't about doing civil rights to make themselves look good, or doing civil rights because it's a spectator sport, so they jump in and jump out when it, you know, and it ends when their little issue is over. And that's how it's used here. An issue breaks out over there, and all these black people showed up, and they deal with that issue, and then they disappear. But the ongoing issue of civil rights in this state is really hard to struggle with, because black people in this state haven't taken responsibility for civil rights yet.
Let me ask you for an update.
Yeah.
What is the present state of the civil rights group with which you were associated? The committee that you were on that sort of got disbanded.
I think I've been pushed off. I think that some of them stayed
Oh, okay.
because nobody will answer that question for me. I made people uneasy. I made the civil rights analyst from Washington, the Republican that came in, I made her uneasy. I made the chairman of the committee uneasy. I made a number of white people on the committee uneasy about my outspokenness and my straightforwardness. And I think I made 2 or 3 of the minorities uneasy who came on the committee also. So I think that I've been forced off the committee.
Well, obviously, I'm sorry to hear that, but I thank you because you certainly were on the right side.
Oh, it was 10 years of agony.
You certainly were on the right side of things. Okay.
It was
All
10.
right.
It was
Okay.
10 years of agony. I sat there struggling. It took Richard Wright and you and I a year just to get that on the agenda. There was a lot of resistance to it. I remember having to tell someone who's dead now, who was with another minority group, that he couldn't call me a nigger. And he was taken aback because I told him, don't ever call me that again. I remember sitting in there when white people were sitting in the room who later jumped on board when they heard all this testimony from a lot of black people, fought this tooth and comb, tooth and nail. 2 or 3 people stood by me, Phil Hoff
Yeah.
and Wanda Arce.
Yep. Yep.
That's who stood with us strong.
Well,
And they looked for all kind of reasons to get out of it.
knowing both of them, I would have expected that. Jeez. It's amazing how.
And then what happened when the report finally did come out, they would go on the radio, and the people who supported it most wouldn't be the people who would be talking about the report on the radio.
Yeah. Okay.
And they then put this black person in as the person they felt was appropriate, when the whole black community knew who fought for that thing to go on there. The very people who turn away from me today are they didn't fight this fight. Those people who sit on that committee now didn't fight this fight. Eric Sagai didn't fight that fight.
Well, it's very sad. That seems like a lot of effort going down the tube.
Well,
But
the
that's
report got
par for
done.
the course.
The report got done, and what I can do is walk away from that knowing I didn't get played. I was never the white boy that they wanted me to be. Because that's what white people expect from you when they do that. It goes on in this town. It happened to me when I was on the board of the Discovery Jazz Festival. It's why I'm not asked to be on other boards in this town. Because of the fact that white people really have a hard time hearing someone tell them that what you're doing is wrong and prejudiced. You and I ran into that when they did that whole study circle thing. You remember that?
But do I remember it? Oh, God. Yes, I remember it, Jeff.
Where they tried to tell you and I that they could spend a Saturday morning for 2 hours and pay somebody $55 and train them to run study circles on racism. This is the game that gets played here locally in Vermont all the time. And the biggest compounders of this problem are the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations. They play this game all the time. It's like walking in there and looking at, what's that organization Eleanor Roosevelt resigned from?
Daughters of the American Revolution.
It's like going in there and looking at the Daughters of the American Revolution. And that's the other thing black people are not supposed to talk about. That white women engage in this as much as white men do. And in some instances, maybe more. And maybe because they're constantly fighting for their rightful place in their society, that they see us as more of a threat to them, to their well-being and power.
Yes, one of the things that has bothered me most about this whole business, and that is that what one would expect, if you look at the history, one would expect that white women who have been put down by white men so badly over historically, that they would have more understanding about issues of equity and so forth and so on. And yet they have been some of the most, some of our enemies, rather than our support mechanism. If you look at that whole vote in California, then when they voted against affirmative action, they were the deciding vote,
Yeah.
and white women benefited more from affirmative action in California than any group, including black people.
When I walked in,
and they knocked it down.
when I was in Washington, D.C., and they had Elizabeth Stanton and this
Right.
other woman, Susan B. Anthony's statue,
Right.
when I know, and I'm saying it because I'm a black man and I'm a survivor, and most of us are survivors, black women have been among the strongest women in this country and get no rhythm, no play from white women about that. They get envy and jealousy and all kind of garbage about it.
And they're at the bottom of the heap.
But it's interesting to me, 43 black members in Congress, 20 are women.
Yeah.
What does that say about our community as opposed to their community?
Yep.
And black men have a lot of problems when it comes to
And the tragedy, the real tragedy of that is that there is so much to be learned from black women, it's not even funny.
Absolutely.
And these people are turned off. They're turned off from it.
The amazing story
It's
about
just
this whole thing
just
is
incredible.
Kilpatrick, the woman who is now the head of the Black Caucus,
Yes.
her 36-year-old son is the mayor of Detroit.
Yeah, I know.
So lay that one. Let's talk about that one again. And again, in Vermont, these are issues that escape the program. You know, I can go into Peace and Justice Center and United Way and the Burlington housing and all that stuff, and I see no black women in positions of authority. Black women play a major role in the black community, in positions of authority and leadership, and are at the forefront of the movement. And when you look at the Black Covenant, you will see as many women as men there. So that's another thing that drives me crazy about Vermont. 10 minutes. Now, education and music have been at the forefront of your life. There's some music I'm not willing to share.
What does that mean?
That just means there's certain black music that I want black people to sing. I'm not into the crossover music thing.
Oh, in other words, you don't want to hear white people sing spirituals.
Or play jazz.
Well, no, I don't know about, we'll have to discuss that one.
Or blues.
We'll have to discuss that one. George Carlin deals with that. So you don't have to ask me about that. George Carlin says, what in the world do white people have the blues about?
And they can play jazz, and that's fine. I'm just not going to buy it.
Yeah, okay.
Or listen to it.
Well,
And one of the things that drives me crazy, if you look at Duke Ellington, who is probably the greatest composer and arranger in the history of modern music in America as we know it today.
I'll buy that.
There's a third name on there. Billy Strayhorn was one of his major people that he did that with.
Yes.
Well, there's this white guy's name down there on his arrangements and his compositions, because he said, if you don't put my name so that I can get part of the royalties, you can't get no gigs.
Oh, John, that's been going on for so long, it's not even.
Well,
funny,
that
man.
means that I don't, in 2006, I'm not going to go around the corner to hear George Gershwin play. I support his right to play it, but if I got a choice between him and Oscar Peterson, I'm going to see Oscar Peterson.
And do you think I don't agree with you?
I'm just telling you.
I'm
And
just
that's
trying
what-
to find out where
and
you're
that's all
going
I'm
with
saying.
this.
Black folks need
I'm
to-
just trying to find out where you're going
Black
with
folks need to
this.
give up this whole, we're going to be more democratic than white people. White people don't have no problem playing our music and not having one musician of color in there. But black people be playing our music, and they got to have a white guy in there playing or a white girl in there playing.
Well, some musicians feel very, very strongly about this and, of course, would not do what you're talking about. Other ones are not as strong about that. It's a funny business because I honestly believe that jazz can be played or can be learned by anybody if they work at it. However, I'll bet anybody that I can tell the difference between a black jazz musician and a white jazz musician just by listening to them. So that there is an element which is very, very different in that whole business. And yet, there are some excellent white jazz players.
I didn't say there wasn't. That's
Okay,
not my point.
all right. I just want to make sure.
My point is that
I want
I'm
to
not
make sure
gonna-
that the message
I'm
that
not
we're
gonna-
getting across
I'm not, I have limited funds,
Yeah, I know.
and
I know.
I'm therefore, I'm not like
I know.
you. I don't have all that money you got. I got to
I
spend
know.
my money.
I'm so wealthy, I don't know what to do with all my money.
I have to spend my money on the people that deserve to have me spend my hard-earned money on first. I have one white singer in my whole collection.
If you really want to know where I am, you come to my house. I have
know where
about
you are.
5,000
I know
CDs,
that.
okay?
But let me
You
ask,
come to my house and
Who-
add up
who's the one white singer I have?
who's the one white singer?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I have no idea.
And that's because she didn't try to cross over
I don't
at
know.
no time in her career. You know who that is?
June Christie?
No,
Who?
Barbara Streisand.
Why?
Because she ain't tried to cross over.
Okay.
She sings what white people should sing.
Okay, and that's true. And
I
that's
don't
true.
want to hear, I ain't going to buy June Christie or Sandra O'Connor or Cat
Well-
Connor.
Well, guess what?
What?
I don't want to hear her.
Right.
You,
Good.
if you think
know.
you're tainted,
I
I
know.
don't want to hear her.
That's not what my point is.
I know it. I know that. But I just want to let you know that.
And I'm not going to buy Harry Connick Jr.
Either am I, John. Either am I. I mean, I don't know why you're trying to separate the two of us because I'm probably more
not
like
trying to-
I'm probably more
I'm-
like you're talking about right now than you are.
I'm not trying to separate us, you know. And the education thing really drives me crazy. And you and I have had so many quality conversations about education. Black History Month drives me crazy. Because if there wasn't for slavery, Jamestown wouldn't have survived. and America wouldn't have survived in particular. America was built on the back of my ancestors. We built their economy, and we put it together. Nothing drives me crazy now when I hear these rags to riches story of some guy who came from Italy in 1929 or 30 and how they've struggled as immigrants. Well, hell, in 1930, my father was as bright as they is, but couldn't get the same chances that they did.
That's correct.
And all that garbage that they talk all the time just drives me crazy. And I don't appreciate first generation Americans run up in my face.
Well, did you see where Virginia has just apologized for slavery?
Yeah.
That's something the United States has not been able to do.
Well, if there's any place that should apologize, it's Virginia.
Of course. That's where it all started. Anyway.
But in closing, because I see the 3-minute sign, there are two people besides Larry and myself who are responsible for this program. One is a man named Ed Everett, who has been our producer, and one is the former director of the Peace and Justice Center, whose name is Ellen Kaler. And Ellen and Ed are remarkable people that I have run into in terms of, and I think, Larry, you agree with this,
Absolutely.
they look outside the box. And the Peace and Justice Center was at its greatest when Ellen Kaler was the leader there, when everybody was welcome at the Peace and Justice Center and when Ellen took it over. I'm not saying it's not true now, but there was a period of time when that is true. And Ellen was also able, the Peace and Justice Center was originally set up to talk about war and international issues. But see, and I'm going to say this in closing, I will change my views when Katrina and New Orleans and that part of the country become as big an issue as Baghdad and the rebuilding of Iraq do. And until Katrina becomes an issue as big in America, I will continue to be the hard-nosed, speak from the shoulder, and suspicious of white folks that as I am, because that more than anything else for me in this country right now. And that's why I'm holding back on Obama, for me, because I have not heard him mention what went on in New Orleans.
Fair enough.
And I don't know, but until New Orleans, until Katrina becomes a bigger issue in this country, as Baghdad does, and until the media apologizes to me for calling those people refugees like they did, I have no sympathy or use and no belief in anything. And I want to thank you, and we will do this again.
Well said.
Good afternoon.
Well said. Thank you very much.